I always thought the worst betrayal would come from a stranger. But I was wrong. It came from someone I loved more than anyone, my own mother. Growing up, my life wasn't perfect, but it was stable. We were a small family, just me, my mom and my younger brother, Jesse. My father had left us when I was 4, and my memories of him were vague, blurry images of arguments, slammed doors, and my mom crying in the kitchen late at night. She never talked about him, and I learned not to ask. I was the good one. That's how my mom always described me. Lena's the responsible one. She helps out. She studies. She keeps everything together. I wore that badge with pride, even when it felt more like a burden than a compliment. Jesse, on the other hand, was different. Charismatic, reckless, and often in trouble. But he was her baby, and there was nothing he could do that would ever change that in her eyes. I remember the day everything shifted. I had just turned 30 and was finally settling into a rhythm in my life. I had a stable job, a cozy apartment, and a partner who loved me for who I was. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, hard-earned and deeply valued. Jesse, meanwhile, had just gotten out of rehab, his 3rd stint in 5 years. Mom was ecstatic. "This time is different," she said, her eyes shining with the kind of hope I had long since stopped allowing myself. I wanted to believe her for her sake. I even let Jesse crash at my place for a few weeks while he got back on his feet. That was my first mistake. What started as temporary quickly became indefinite. He didn't look for work, didn't help with rent, and spent most of his days sleeping or disappearing without explanation. My partner, Eric, tried to be supportive, but the tension was growing. The apartment that once felt warm and peaceful was now cold and strained. Then came the thefts, little things at first. My necklace went missing. Cash I was sure I had tucked into my drawer vanished. I confronted Jesse gently at first, but he denied everything with a hurt expression that made me feel guilty for even asking. Mom, of course, took his side immediately. "How could you accuse your brother like that? After all he's been through?" It hurt. But what hurt more was when I learned. Jesse had told her a very different version of events, that I was unstable, jealous, and trying to sabotage his recovery. And she believed him. I sat in my car that night, hands shaking on the steering wheel, staring at the apartment building that no longer felt like home. I realized then that my mother didn't see me anymore. Or maybe she never really had. My name is Lena Walker, and this is the story of how I lost everything I built, not to strangers, but to the people I called family. The day Jesse stole from me and made me the villain was the day something inside me began to crack. Not all at once, more like a slow, painful fracture that spread with every betrayal. I wanted to scream, to make my mother see what he was doing. But every time I opened my mouth, her eyes would glaze over, as if she was hearing noise instead of words. She visited my apartment often during those weeks, and each time she brought food for Jesse, hugged him like he'd returned from war, and avoided eye contact with me. She didn't ask how my work was going. She didn't thank me for opening my home. And she certainly didn't see the exhaustion written across my face like neon lights. Eric was patient, more patient than I deserved. He kept reminding me that this was temporary, that we just needed to get Jesse into a place of his own. But I could feel him pulling away little things at first. He'd come home late. He stopped leaving notes. And our conversations became short, functional, like roommates discussing groceries and bills instead of dreams and plans. One night, I got home from work and found Eric sitting on the couch, pale and quiet. Jesse wasn't there. "I found your savings account statements," he said, his voice tight. "Over $2,000 is missing." I felt like the ground opened beneath me. I ran to my room, opened the drawer where I kept the envelope, and it was gone. That money was meant for our future, a wedding, a home, maybe even a child one day. I had saved it bit by bit over the years, skipping vacations, working weekends. Now it was gone. Jesse came home around midnight, reeking of alcohol and arrogance. When I confronted him, he laughed. "You left it in a drawer. That's on you," I snapped. I screamed in a way I didn't recognize. I told him to get out, that he wasn't my responsibility, that I was done. He shrugged, grabbed his backpack, and left. I locked the door behind him, heart pounding. The next morning, I got a call from my mother. "How could you throw your brother out like that, after everything he's been through?" I told her about the money, the lying, the manipulation, and she dismissed it like it was a minor misunderstanding. She told me I was being cruel, that I didn't understand addiction, that Jesse needed love, not judgment. "I can't believe you're my daughter," she said. That one sentence broke me more than Jesse's betrayal ever could. I wanted to believe that this would be the lowest point, that things couldn't possibly get worse. But I was wrong, so wrong. After that phone call, I didn't speak to my mother for weeks. Not because I was angry, though. But because I couldn't handle the ache her words had left in me. "I can't believe you're my daughter." It echoed in my head like a curse. I spent those weeks trying to rebuild the quiet in my life. Eric and I began to talk again. Truly talk. We decided to take a break from the wedding plans and focus on healing, on rediscovering why we'd fallen in love in the first place. I started sleeping better. The apartment, now Jessie-free, felt light again. For a moment, I began to think that maybe we could move on. Then came the knock on the door. It was a social worker. She introduced herself politely, but the questions were anything but gentle. "Do you have a history of violence in the home? Have you ever withheld medication from a family member? Is it true you kicked your brother out with no resources or support?" I was blindsided. I told her the truth about the money, the lies, the drinking. She took notes but said little. After she left, I stood in the middle of my living room, shaking. Who had told her these things? I already knew the answer. I called my mother. She didn't deny it. In fact, she doubled down, said she was worried for Jessie, and when he told her I'd been abusive and manipulative, she felt she had to act. "He's your brother, Lena. Blood is everything." I remember laughing a sharp, humorless sound. "You're right, Mom. Blood is everything. And right now, mine's boiling." I hung up before she could respond. Later that night, Eric sat beside me on the couch. He held my hand, rubbed gentle circles into my palm, and whispered, "I know it hurts, but you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Not Jessie, not your mom." I cried in his arms until I had nothing left in me. The next morning, I packed a box of my mother's things, photos, gifts, old birthday cards, and put them in storage. I wasn't ready to throw them away. But I couldn't have them in my home anymore. Not when every glance reminded me that the woman who raised me had chosen someone else's lies over my truth. I thought I'd feel lighter. I didn't. I felt empty. And in that emptiness, I began to wonder, if my own mother could turn on me, who else could? A few weeks passed in relative quiet. No calls from my mother. No messages from Jessie. The silence should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It was heavy, charged with the knowledge that something was brewing just out of sight. Eric and I tried to settle back into normalcy. We spent evenings cooking together, watching old movies and taking walks in the park. For a time, I allowed myself to believe the worst was behind us. That maybe I could close the chapter titled Family and begin something new, something just ours. But that peace didn't last long. One evening, I came home from work to find a letter taped to our door. It was handwritten in my mother's delicate, familiar script. "You've abandoned your family, Lena. You've changed. You think you're better than the rest of us because you have a job and a fiancé. But one day you'll see blood ties don't just disappear. You'll need us again. And when you do, I hope we remember how you treated us." It wasn't signed. But it didn't need to be. I stared at the letter for what felt like hours, numb and wordless. Eric found me like that, standing in the hallway, letter in hand, face pale with shock. He read it. Then quietly, he took it from me and threw it in the trash. "She's trying to control you," he said. "Trying to pull you back into her version of the story." But the thing was, it worked. The letter consumed me. I thought about it constantly. I replayed our arguments. I reread old texts. I dug through voicemail archives just to find one message from her that didn't feel like a dagger. I didn't find one. Then, one afternoon, I got a message from Jessie. It was a photo of him and my mother smiling at some restaurant, holding up wine glasses like they had just won something. The caption read, "We're doing just fine without you." No words, no apology, no context, just cruelty. I broke down in the shower that night, the kind of crying that leaves you breathless and sore, like your ribs have been cracked open from the inside. Eric sat on the bathroom floor with me, fully clothed, holding me like he could keep me from dissolving. I didn't say a word. I couldn't, but in that moment I knew something had shifted, not just between me and my family, but within me. Something was starting to burn. Not anger, not sadness, something darker. The next morning I woke up different. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden thunderclap of realization or cinematic resolve. Just a stillness, a terrifying calm, like something inside me had finally stopped struggling and started watching. I went about my day like normal, smiled at the barista, answered emails, laughed at my coworkers' jokes. But under it all, something new had settled in. Resolve. I wasn't going to let them win. For so long, I'd been trying to reason with chaos, to prove myself to people who had no interest in seeing me clearly. My mother didn't want the truth, she wanted obedience. Jesse didn't want help, he wanted control. And I had spent years shrinking myself, twisting into versions they could accept. I was done with that. That night, I dug out an old journal, one I hadn't touched since college. In it, I began to write not about pain, but about patterns. I listed every time my mother had made me feel small, every time Jesse had taken advantage, every time I'd second-guessed my reality just to keep the peace. Then I made a new list. Boundaries. Simple ones. Like, I will not respond to manipulative messages. Or, I will not justify my choices to people who refuse to understand me. I taped those pages to my mirror, and then quietly I began to pull back. I didn't respond to the next 3 texts from Jesse. I didn't return my mother's call on her birthday. I didn't send the usual holiday card with the handwritten note about how I hoped things would heal. And do you know what happened? Nothing. No apology, no panic, no sudden realization from them. Just silence, and in that silence I found space to breathe. One evening, Eric noticed the shift in me. "You seem lighter," he said, watching me over his wine glass. "Like something's changed." I smiled, not a performative one, but a real, slow kind of smile. "I think I'm learning how to let go." But just as I began to reclaim myself, something unexpected happened. My aunt, my mother's sister, reached out. She sent a simple message. "I heard what happened. Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long time. My aunt and I had never been close. She was the black sheep, the one my mother always spoke about in hushed tones, as if rebellion was contagious. But maybe that's why I didn't delete the message. Maybe someone in my family had finally seen through the smoke. I met my Aunt Marianne at a quiet cafe near the edge of town. It was the kind of place where time felt slower, wood-paneled walls, steaming mugs, and the hum of low jazz in the background. She looked older than I remembered, but softer somehow. Less like a cautionary tale and more like a survivor. "Lena," she said, wrapping me in a hug that surprised us both. "I've been waiting for this moment for years." We sat. She didn't ask about Mom or Jesse right away. Instead, she asked about me, my job, Eric, our home. No judgment, no suggestions. Just listening. Eventually, I asked the question that had been burning since I got her message. "Why now?" She sipped her tea slowly. "Because I heard what your mother did. And because I saw myself in you." She told me stories I'd never heard about growing up under the same sharp tongue, the same impossible expectations. How she too had tried to be the good daughter, the fixer. Until she couldn't anymore. "She cut me out just like she did to you," she said with a shrug that barely masked the pain. But I built a life anyway, a quieter one, a real one. I felt a lump rise in my throat. It was the first time in weeks, maybe months, that I didn't feel alone in my story. "She'll never change, Lena," Marianne said gently. "But you don't have to keep hoping she will." That night I cried, not out of sadness but release. Someone had seen the same darkness I had, and lived to tell the tale. There was comfort in that, power even. Over the next few weeks I began writing more, not just in the journal but actual stories, pieces about women who break free, about daughters who stop bleeding for mothers who never learned to stop cutting. I sent one to a local literary blog. It got published. Eric printed it out and framed it. "You're telling your truth," he said. "People are listening." For the first time in my adult life, I felt like my voice wasn't something to hide or soften. It was sharp, maybe even a little jagged, but it was mine. Still, healing is never linear. Just when I thought I'd turned a corner, Jesse sent another message. This one was different. It was a voice note, shaky, slurred. "Lena, I messed up. I need you, please. I don't know who else to call." I stared at the notification, heart pounding. The past tugged at me like an old habit, but something inside whispered, "You get to choose now." And for the first time, I truly believed it. I didn't listen to Jesse's message right away. For hours, I just let it sit there, a digital ghost hovering in my notifications. I went for a walk, cleaned the kitchen, played music loud enough to drown out the thoughts crawling under my skin. But eventually, curiosity won. I sat on the edge of my bed, pressed play, and held my breath. His voice was unmistakably broken, slurred, maybe drunk, maybe worse. "Lena, I don't know what to say. I messed up. Mom's not answering. I need you. Please, just talk to me. Please." I sat in silence long after the message ended. This was the same Jesse who had screamed at me for setting boundaries, who had mocked my emotions, twisted my words, and made me feel like I was always one mistake away from being unlovable. And now, when his world was crumbling, I was the one he called. Not because he respected me, because I was familiar, because I'd always picked up before. But I was different now. I listened to the message one more time, not for pity, not out of guilt, but to really hear it, to hear the manipulation hidden under the desperation, the way he still said need instead of sorry, the way it was always about him. Eric found me staring at my phone. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I am." I didn't respond to Jesse. Instead, I opened a blank note on my phone and typed, "You are not responsible for healing the wounds that other people keep reopening." I read it out loud, twice. Later that week, I submitted a second story to the blog, this one about emotional blackmail, about how the people who hurt you are often the ones who act wounded when you stop letting them. It went viral. Messages flooded in from women, from men, from strangers who felt seen, who had lived the same cycle and didn't know how to end it until they read my words. One message stood out. "Your story gave me permission to walk away." "Thank you," I cried again, quietly, because this time it wasn't grief. It was a strange, soft kind of pride. A few days later, Jesse sent another message, this one shorter, colder. "Guess you don't care anymore. Figures." I didn't reply. I didn't even feel the urge. Because for once in my life, I wasn't performing forgiveness. I wasn't chasing peace that always came at my own expense. I was choosing silence, and in that silence, I finally felt free. The days that followed felt strangely calm. No messages, no drama. Just quiet. I thought I'd feel emptiness, that familiar ache of disconnection. But instead, I felt space real. Breathing space. Like for the first time, my life had room for something more than just damage control. I spent mornings writing and evenings walking with Eric. We talked more. Laughed more. Sometimes we said nothing at all. Just shared silence like old friends who didn't need to fill every gap with words. One afternoon, he handed me a thick envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "Just something I've been working on." Inside were printouts not just of my published pieces, but comments from readers. Pages and pages of strangers connecting to the stories I'd written. "You're not just healing, Lena," Eric said. "You're helping others do it too." I didn't know what to say, so I cried, again. But this time the tears felt like sunlight on old wounds. I began to consider something I'd never let myself imagine before. A book. Not a bestseller, not a memoir to win approval or prove something, just a collection stories of grief and boundaries, guilt and courage. A place to gather all the versions of myself that had been silenced and give them voice. The idea didn't scare me. It made me feel powerful. But healing isn't a straight line, and it's never finished. A few weeks later, I got a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Later, curiosity nudged me to listen. It was my mother. Her voice was tired, slower than I remembered. "Lena, I heard about your stories. People are talking. Families asking questions. If you're going to air our dirty laundry, at least tell the truth." I stared at my phone, pulse thudding in my ears. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even concern. It was about control, always had been. That night, I wrote another story. This one wasn't subtle. It was raw and direct. A piece about mothers who weaponize silence, who punish truth-telling, who rewrite history to protect their own egos. I didn't name her. I didn't have to. The story was accepted within hours. It was titled, "When the Truth Becomes a Threat." And in that moment, I realized something vital. Speaking out doesn't make you cruel. It makes you free. I wasn't writing to hurt anyone. I was writing to survive. And maybe, just maybe, to help someone else do the same. I had always believed that healing would look like forgiveness. That one day, I'd sit across from my mother or Jesse or any of the ghosts that once haunted me and offer them peace with a gentle smile. But healing, I was learning, didn't always come with closure. Sometimes it came with distance, sometimes with unapologetic truth, and sometimes it came when you stopped waiting for others to validate your pain. The article about my mother's call gained traction quickly. Readers resonated with it not just because it was well written, but because it was real, messy, uncomfortable. I received a message from a woman named Priya. She wrote, "You gave words to what I've felt for years. Thank you for making me feel seen." That sentence echoed in my mind for days. All my life I had been trying to feel seen, to be understood, to be safe. And now by telling the truth, my truth, I was helping others feel those very things. The irony wasn't lost on me. One afternoon, I was invited to speak on a podcast about personal narratives and emotional resilience. I nearly said no. The idea of sharing my voice, not just my writing, terrified me. But Eric encouraged me. "You've already been brave," he said. "This is just a different kind of courage." So I agreed. When the host asked how I found the strength to tell such raw, painful stories, I didn't have a rehearsed answer. I just said, "I got tired of carrying other people's shame." There was a pause. Then he said, "That might be the most powerful thing anyone's ever said on this show." And maybe it was, because it wasn't just a statement. It was a decision. I was done protecting the people who hurt me, done minimizing my pain to keep others comfortable, done pretending that surviving abuse was something to be whispered about in shadows. I was done. Later that week, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten. "You think you're brave, but all you've done is destroy what little family you had left." No name. No signature, but I knew exactly who it was from. I folded the letter in half and dropped it into the trash. I didn't feel shaken, or guilty, or even sad. I felt clear. Letting go of people isn't cruel. Forcing yourself to stay small for their comfort, that's the real tragedy. I sat on my balcony that night, watching the city breathe under a blanket of quiet. It was one of those moments where the world felt both enormous and painfully intimate. I had spent years carrying shadows, and now they were finally behind me. Not gone, but behind me. That's when I made the decision. I was going to write the book, not just a collection of essays, a full-length memoir. My story from the childhood bruises to the adult betrayals, from silence to voice. It felt terrifying. And right, I told Eric about it over coffee the next morning. His face lit up. "I was wondering when you'd finally say it out loud." I laughed. "I think I just needed to believe I was allowed to." "You always were," he said. "But now you believe it." The next weeks were a blur of late nights, early mornings, and pages filled with blood and bone. Writing my truth wasn't cathartic. It was exhausting. It felt like excavating myself from beneath years of rubble. But with every chapter, I felt lighter. And then the letter came, this time not anonymous. It was from Jesse, neatly typed, a full page. No apology, not really, but a strange attempt at closure. He wrote, "I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. I wasn't the man you needed or deserved. But reading your stories, I see it now. I see you now. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that." I read it once, twice. Then I tucked it into a drawer. Not because I forgave him, but because I didn't need to carry it anymore. Letting go, I realized, doesn't always mean release with anger. Sometimes it's just setting something down and walking away. That night, I sat at my desk and typed the final paragraph of my manuscript. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. Then, with steady fingers, I wrote, "My name is Lena Callahan, and for years, I was made to feel like I was too much, too loud, too emotional, too broken. But the truth is I was never too much. They were simply never enough." I hit save, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like an author, like a woman who survived. And finally, like someone who had come home to herself. When I submitted the final manuscript of my book, I felt both a deep exhale and an eerie silence. No confetti, no celebration, just me in my tiny apartment, sipping lukewarm tea and watching a blinking cursor disappear into the void. I didn't expect much. Maybe a handful of people would read it. Maybe none. That didn't matter. What mattered was that I had said the words I once believed I'd die carrying. I thought I was done. But healing, I've learned, doesn't always end with the truth. Sometimes it begins there. The first email came 2 days after the book was released. "I saw myself in your story." I cried. "Thank you for writing what I could never say." I stared at the screen for a full minute, rereading the words as if they might vanish. Then came another message. And another. By the end of the week, there were dozens. Women, men, strangers, survivors. Some signed their names. Others didn't. They wrote about pain, shame, rage. But mostly, they wrote about feeling seen, truly seen for the first time. My story, the one I wrote in the dark, was echoing in other people's silence. The numbers on the book's sales page started to rise. Slowly, then steadily. Reviews poured in, some focused on the writing, others on how the story felt like a lifeline. Then came the social media messages, posts with highlighted passages, TikToks with tearful reactions, people underlining my name and calling me brave, raw, real. I didn't feel brave. I felt cracked open, vulnerable. But I began to understand. People weren't just reading about me. They were reading themselves in the spaces between my lines. A month later, I got a call from a producer at a large podcast. "We'd love to have you on," she said. "Your voice is starting a movement." I was stunned into silence. I'd spent so long hiding, so long believing no one would ever care about my truth, and now the world was not only listening, it was inviting me to speak louder. The night before the interview, I stood in front of my mirror, staring at a version of myself I barely recognized. No makeup, eyes tired but clear, a woman who had survived, a woman who now carried other people's stories too. And I said aloud, for no one to hear but myself, "You matter. Your voice matters." The next morning, I walked into the studio, my hands shaking but my spine straight. Not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a woman who had turned her pain into purpose. After the podcast aired, everything changed. My inbox was no longer a quiet space, it became a floodgate. Survivors, therapists, advocates, strangers. Some wrote only a few words. "Thank you." Others poured out entire chapters of their lives, like they'd been waiting for a crack in the world where they could finally speak. And I read every single one. There were nights I cried, not for myself, but for them. For the child still trapped inside someone's memory. For the woman hiding bruises behind boardroom smiles. For the man who'd never told a soul until he typed it into a message. Box at 3 a.m. My little book had become something I never intended. A mirror, a door, a lifeline. Invitations followed. Local universities reached out, asking if I'd speak to their psychology students about narrative therapy. A women's shelter invited me to visit. A nonprofit wanted to adapt parts of my story into an educational resource. The most surreal was when I was flown out to speak on a panel at a national trauma and recovery summit. They booked my flight, my hotel. I had a name badge with author printed below my name. I stood backstage with clinicians, psychologists, and speakers with best-selling books. And then there was me. I thought I'd be terrified. I wasn't. When I walked on stage, the lights were so bright I couldn't see the crowd. That helped. I spoke with my hands clenched at first, but soon I stopped noticing them. I just spoke. I didn't talk about statistics. I talked about silence. I didn't preach. I told the truth. And the truth is this. The worst things that happened to me didn't end me. They changed me. But they also taught me that being broken doesn't make you worthless. It makes you human. After the panel, a woman in her 50s approached me. She looked like someone's aunt or teacher. Normal. Kind. Soft-eyed. "I've never told anyone," she whispered. "Not even my husband. But you gave me the courage." And she hugged me, long and tight, like we were tethered by something invisible but real. I used to think my story was a burden. Now I saw it was a bridge, one I could walk across, hand in hand with others. A few weeks after the summit, I found myself staring at an unopened box in the back of my closet. It was taped shut, the corners soft from age. I knew exactly what was inside, my mother's old journals. I hadn't touched them since the week she died. Back then, reading them felt like pressing on a bruise. Her words were too raw, too tangled in bitterness and regret. But now, I felt ready. Or maybe I was just tired of being afraid. I opened the box slowly, the smell of paper and old perfume rising like a ghost. Her handwriting hadn't changed. Still sharp, still impatient. I flipped through the pages, some mundane, some angry, some hauntingly poetic. I found pieces of her I never knew. Her fears, her disappointments, her broken dreams. In some strange way, I understood her more in those pages than I ever had in person. And yet I couldn't forgive everything. Some pages made my stomach twist. She had known. About him. About the things that happened. And she had done nothing. But instead of closing the journal, I kept reading. I found one entry near the end written a week before her death. "Lena has stopped speaking to me. I think she knows more than she lets on. I see the hurt in her eyes. And I wonder if she'll ever forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I hope one day she finds peace, even if it's without me." I sat there for a long time, holding the book against my chest. I didn't cry, I just breathed. Deeply. Like something tight had finally let go. That night I wrote letters. To my mother. To my younger self. To the version of me who stayed silent for too long. To the girl who thought survival meant shrinking. I didn't send them. I burned them. Not in anger. In release. Watching the paper curl and darken in the fireplace, I felt something sacred unfold inside me. I wasn't erasing my story. I was honoring it by letting go of the parts that no longer served me. The guilt, the silence, the need for someone else to say, "I'm sorry." I had said it to myself, and that had to be enough. The seasons shifted while I wasn't watching. The trees outside my apartment shed their leaves in silence, and one morning, I noticed the first bloom of spring pushing through the thawed earth. It felt symbolic, like the world was giving me permission to begin again. I started walking more, not to escape but to observe. The streets I used to rush through now held stories, kids chalking on the pavement, strangers exchanging tired nods, the warmth of a coffee cup pressed between cold fingers. Life, in its ordinary way, was whispering to me again. Therapy changed, too. It became less about surviving and more about exploring. Who was I when I wasn't wounded? Who was I when I wasn't trying to protect everyone else? The questions terrified me at first, but I was learning to sit with the unknown, to befriend the silence instead of fearing it. I went to bookstores without flinching at the memoir section. I even found my own book, nestled on a display with a tiny, handwritten note from a staff member, a must-read for anyone finding their way home. I stood there for a while, unsure whether to laugh or cry. One afternoon, I saw her, the girl from the shelter, the one who had once slipped a bracelet into my palm and whispered, "You'll be okay." She was working at a flower shop now, arranging tulips with a kind of focus that reminded me of healing. I didn't interrupt. I just smiled and walked on, carrying the echo of her hope. I began to host small writing circles, not formal workshops, just a group of women, some broken, some building, all brave. We wrote about pain, yes, but also joy, love, the smell of bread, the sting of betrayal, the way laughter sounds different when it comes from the gut. I was no longer afraid to speak, but more importantly, I was no longer afraid to be quiet. And somewhere along the way, I looked in the mirror and saw someone I didn't hate. My hair was longer now. I wore colors that once made me feel exposed. I danced while brushing my teeth. I told people when I needed space and when I needed them close. I forgave slowly, and only when it felt real. I stopped apologizing for crying. I had become someone I could love. Not in spite of my past, but because of what it had taught me. That scars are not shameful. That survival is sacred. That there's beauty in starting over, again and again. The house was quiet. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of before, but the kind that felt earned, gentle, present. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, hands curled around the warmth like it could anchor me to this moment. The wind moved through the trees like a lullaby, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I had to brace myself for what came next. There was no storm on the horizon, just stillness. I had moved back to the town I once fled from, not out of necessity but by choice. A strange kind of full circle. My childhood home had long since been sold, but the street still remembered my footsteps. I found a small cottage near the woods, with creaky floorboards and mismatched tiles that somehow felt like me. The publisher had asked if I'd write a second book. I told them maybe. Not everything needed to be a story. Some things were just meant to be lived. But I did keep writing letters to no one, scraps of poetry in the margins of notebooks, voice memos whispered into the dark when memories surfaced. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying the past without letting it crush me. People still messaged me. A woman from Sweden who said my story helped her leave an abusive marriage. A teen in Ohio who used my words in her college essay. A man who said he cried for the first time in 20 years. It was humbling and strange because for so long, I'd believed my voice had no place in the world, and now it echoed. But beyond all that, the book, the readers, the quiet applause, the most profound moment came unexpectedly. I was at the market, just a normal Tuesday, picking apples, and a little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at me. "Is that her?" she whispered. "From the book?" Her mother smiled and nodded gently. I met the girl's eyes. She didn't say anything else. She just gave me a small wave, the kind you give to someone who made you feel less alone. And I waved back. It was such a small thing, but it stayed with me. Not because I felt important, but because I realized I had become visible again. To the world, to others, to myself. That night, I lit a candle and sat in the dark. Not to mourn, not to fear, but to thank the girl I used to be, the one who kept breathing even when it hurt. The one who held onto stories like rope. The one who never stopped hoping someone someday would listen. And someone did. Maybe 1,000 someones. Maybe just one. But most importantly, I listened. To myself. To the quiet after. And it was enough.